Well, I'm pleased to be reaching this chapter in the series, titled What Can Be Done, because I think it's from this point on you are going to really begin to love this book, and Katie. Welcome back to the series of me discussing Daniel Hughes' renowned book, Building the Bonds of Attachment, for which I leave a link for you to buy in the description, but I'm going to begin today with that idea about becoming emotionally invested in Katie as a character, precisely because a great many of you, and I get this sense from some of the comments, might not believe that will actually happen. I mean, you understand it will in the context of the book, obviously, but if Katie was a real person you'd encountered in your own life, that would be challenging to believe that she could change. Especially if there's not me here telling you it's going to happen, you know? And it makes me think of how regularly clients in counselling can worry you don't like them, or that you'll get fed up with them, or that you can't wait to see the back of them, which in my experience isn't what counsellors feel, but is a big fear. You know, it sounds paradoxical, but we can care for and have love for children like Katie, even if we at times no doubt hate the sort of behaviour they exhibit even. Sometimes I think that's one of the most important parts of counselling, genuinely and authentically caring for the client and hopefully reaching a point where they actually start to see that care and really believe it. Sometimes that's a great struggle for them, and sometimes we also have what Dan Hughes terms blocked care, which we'll come on to later in the story, but I think the experience of coming to care for Katie via this story, just naturally on its own, will emphasise the point better than I could in explanation. You can still have care and affection for someone whose behaviour you abhor, at sometimes might even be disturbed by. But anyway, last time we left off with the poo in the burger incident and Stephen being advised he should seek out Dr. Allison Kaplan to evaluate Katie. I really love all the chapters with Allison in them because we get some wonderful descriptions of her therapy, aka Dan Hughes' therapy, called Dyadic Developmental Psychotherapy, or DDP for short. At some point we will get on to discussing more in detail about what exactly DDP is, but for now I tend to think it's best to just let the story run for itself and show examples of therapy first and discuss the bits we see, rather than step out to try and explain everything in the therapy as a whole in one big chunk. It's very different to my training though. Even if Dan Hughes is an influence on my personal approach to therapy, even before reading this book, because my supervisor had introduced me to a lot of his ideas in the past, I'm largely saying that as a disclaimer, that there are lots of different approaches to therapy. This story showcases one of them that's very different to my own training. And as we know, this sort of therapy won't suit every situation. It's designed specifically more for kids like Katie. So yeah, it's important to say that, and to also point out this first meeting is an evaluation, not the actual therapy work itself yet. But the meeting begins first with Allison talking to Stephen Fields, the caseworker, and Susan, the previous foster mum who remember reached her breaking point with Katie during the poo in Burger Meat incident. So it's Allison talking to them while Katie's in a waiting room, so Allison can get some idea of the background basically before meeting Katie. But then Allison goes out to fetch Katie and there's a bit of a moment and a kerfuffle before she comes back with her saying, "Katie didn't want to stop playing with the toys," Allison said in a relaxed and mildly playful tone. "So I told her that she needed to come in here with us and she had a choice. She could walk in or the toys would come into my room while Susan, you and I would meet with Katie in the waiting room." Oh, she did not like to hear that. Either way, no toys. Well, she decided to come with us to this room, which I guess is more comfortable than the waiting room. Stephen noticed that Allison was fairly direct, but in a nice way. He wondered if Katie would now give her the silent treatment. Allison quickly shifted gears and made a fuss about Katie's shirt colour. Katie responded rapidly and positively when Allison brought over a toy cat that had the same shade of tan as her shirt. I don't think my voice is the best one to convey tones, you just have to trust there's a mildly playful tone to what Allison says. But I don't want to give you the wrong idea about this. This shifting of the gears we see there between the no toys thing and then making a fuss about her hair and her shirt colour, it's not the ideal thing to do with many kids, and you'll see with time how the amount this shifting of gears is done lessens. It's partly because Katie is someone who does struggle to manage a great deal of conversation, a long stretch of interaction and connection with somebody. It's unfamiliar for her, and after too long, that connection needs to be broken up, because the idea of being that connected for that amount of time is difficult. And we'll see good examples of how Katie does that sort of thing in her life later on. I don't think there's been too many good examples so far in the story, but so it's partly for that. Shifting gears before any one stretch of a conversation becomes too much. Secondly, to avoid getting caught in a war with a kid who doesn't back down, and avoid letting the shame linger for too long with a kid who struggles to manage it. The important point though, what this sudden shifting from the conflict to then talking happily about Katie's shirt colour or whatever else, what it's not a means to do is avoid conflict. That would be the complete wrong thing to do. That would be teaching Katie that conflict and her anger is something that can't be faced up to and has to be avoided. That would not be great. So notice, for example, Allison still sets the boundaries and the rules, still acknowledges Katie's behaviour, she voices it, this is what Katie feels, she didn't like me saying no to the toys, but she is coming with us. That's not avoiding the conflict and kind of turning Katie's annoyance into this elephant in the room, it's voicing it, but also not being, not acquiescing to it. Allison let her hold the cat, and said that the cat could talk for her if Katie had trouble talking. Katie said she wanted to play with the other toys too, and when Allison denied this request, Katie threw the cat down. "You're mad at the cat because I said no?" Allison asked. "Or are you really mad at me, but aren't sure if you want to tell me?" "No problem with telling me. Why don't you say? I'm mad because you won't let me play with the animals. I'm really mad at you." Katie didn't respond. "Since you don't want to say it, have the cat say it for you," Allison said. Katie ignored her. Allison picked up the cat and she spoke for Katie. This annoyed Katie, and she put her fingers in her ears. "I see what you mean, Susan. It really is hard for Katie when she can't do what she wants to do. She just seems to get madder and madder." Allison then began talking to Susan about Katie's hair. Stephen noticed that very quickly Katie was talking with Allison again. Allison seemed to have a way to keep Katie relating positively, even after there was a conflict. Remember, of course, Katie is only 6 years old here, although with a much younger emotional age than that, so the idea of a cat speaking for her probably isn't as odd as it might sound reading this. But it's just nice, isn't it? Allison is able to set the boundaries without going to war over them. Allison is neither avoiding nor shaming the conflict. She's accepting it. She's saying, "I see you're mad at me, Katie, because I've said no toys. That's okay. You can be mad at me, you know? It's absolutely fine for Katie to feel mad. Anger is an ordinary human emotion, and right now, not getting her way is something Katie really, really does struggle with. We have to understand that. It is a genuinely big challenge for her, and it leads to feelings of shame and rejection and vulnerability. So, it's perfectly understandable, acceptable, likely, okay for her to feel angry. We can empathise with that, however, the rules are still the rules. So, provided you are doing that with genuine empathy for their anger, rather than in a stern, kinda cold way, then it makes sense, you know? She does them both and then moves things along, talks happily with Katie about her hair. You know, remember I talked before about the importance of parents repairing the relationship with children after moments where they feel shame? That's happening here in a slightly simpler, more childish way than would suit, I think, most kids. It's showing they can have fallouts, and they've had this one, and Allison is able to accept it and notice it and voice it, but Allison will still enjoy her company regardless. They can still get along. After more small talk, Allison moved her chair closer to Katie and began to focus on Katie's past life, without changing anything about her manner of relating, or even her tone of voice. "Susan's been mentioning you had some hard times living with her, and Stephen said that you had a hard time when you were living in Karen and Ruth's homes too, but my guess is that the hardest time was when you were living with your mum and dad, Sally and Mike." Katie immediately became tense and looked away. Just as suddenly she said, "They were mean to me. Mike hit me and kicked me. He even peed on me." "Oh, Katie, that must have hurt you so much. You were so little. And they were your parents. And parents aren't supposed to hurt their kids that way." Katie struggled for something else to say. She was not comfortable with Allison's empathy for her pain. "And they didn't feed me. And they never played with me. They said I was bad." "They hurt you so much, Katie," Allison said more quietly than before. "I'll bet you were so sad you cried a lot. I didn't cry, Katie exclaimed. I hit them and was mean to them. I can see why, Katie, since they were mean to you, and they were your parents. But you were so little. I bet you wanted to cry a little bit, once in a while. I didn't cry, Katie said again. I'll bet you found a way to stop crying, Katie. Good for you. Crying when you're a little girl and all alone is very painful. I'm glad that you stopped crying. And it never should have happened, Katie. And it never taught you how to live in a good family. They didn't teach you how to play with your parents. They didn't teach you how to do things with them. They didn't teach you how to have fun with your parents. No wonder it's been hard for you to learn to live in the good homes that you've been to since. They never taught you. Katie doesn't respond to this at all, which is entirely expected, and Allison then signals for them to both take a deep breath and talk about something else again. This is all obviously incredibly direct, and it's not the sort of thing I'd do in therapy, not without some sense they wanted or were able to talk about these things first. It's not something I don't think anyone should do in therapy without clear sense and understanding of what they're doing. And yeah, in ordinary therapy this isn't likely to happen, it's not common. And to just outright engage someone about the deep stuff can be very painful and not at all helpful in a lot of situations. Having said that, it happens here, and there is some sense to openly discussing these things with someone like Katie, because one, she doesn't form attachments. Where giving people time and space to open up in a way they feel comfortable with is certainly the best thing to do in most situations. Katie probably never would open up because she never would form that attachment. She's never learned how to, you know? Here, the counsellor might have to be a bit more proactive than usual. And if you can do it in very small bits before moving the conversation away to something easier again and not expecting Katie to respond to anything, you know, watching attentively to see how she's managing what you're saying, then it can be a good thing. An experience to gradually show her that these things can be thought about a little bit. They don't have to be blocked, they don't have to be avoided. Your vulnerable feelings can be given attention. And what we see above is actually Katie fairly able to talk about them at first, if not to connect with the emotion within. Katie is able to talk and probably seeks to gain some power out of the exchange, but is then made uncomfortable by the empathy, so they stop before it's too uncomfortable and too unbearable. You know, it's like bite-sized chunks of empathy, I suppose. And as I said, this won't just be Allison blindly stumbling into talking about these things. She'll be very alert, paying very close attention to how Katie reacts to what she's saying, so that if it is clearly too much for Katie, if it looks too painful, she'll stop. Which is what she does in the end. They take a deep breath and they move things along to something else. The other important thing you'll notice in the conversation, however, is that Allison's openness towards Katie remains the same. Allison is not stern or edgy or uncomfortable talking about these things, because all feelings are things we can talk about and can accept. All sides of a person can be taken in, not just the nice, charming Katie, but bad Katie too, or vulnerable Katie, which is probably the part Katie herself most wants to avoid. All of them are acceptable and manageable because the counsellor accepts all of a person. That's not just a wishy-washy statement about counselling, it has to be the truth to do the work effectively. So, I think a lot of this chapter so far has just been an introduction to a few things we'll see more of in the future with Allison and with Jackie, who is the next foster mother. This is just an evaluation. We will see more comprehensive scenes in the future, but this is just our kind of first sight. I did, however, quote that above extract with reason. Allison talking about Katie not being taught how to live in a good family, which is obviously putting things into words kids might understand. Also the line, no wonder it's been hard for you to learn how to live in the good homes that you've been to since. They never taught you. It's a good sort of thing to do with kids because it's more like wondering about things rather than telling them how it is. You know, it's like Allison pondering Katie's behaviour in the here and now and just kind of realising, no wonder that's the case. You wouldn't want to do that like a complete act, and often it's not. Often you are just discovering things in the moment, but it's good because it feels a little less direct that way. Not this is the truth, but I'm just wondering if maybe. You know, it involves them in the thinking more and encourages them to think, and also just demonstrates that you are curious and interested in them as a person in the here and now. You're thinking about them, you know? But anyway, I quoted that extract because I guess it's kind of the main thing to take away from this chapter so far. They didn't teach you how to play with your parents. They didn't teach you how to do things with them. They didn't teach you how to have fun with your parents. It's what I hit on at the end of the last chapter, if you remember, the importance of having fun with a child and enjoying their presence. How much of a part this will play in the work with Katie ahead. Sometimes therapy is very hard and emotional and you have to do a lot of difficult thinking, but it also has to be fun too. You have to enjoy each other's company. However, as we've seen in all the conversation with Allison so far, only in digestible moments of fun, and then gradually, hopefully build it up into less fractured, more free-flowing interaction with time. So what can we take away? I'm going to finish in light of this actually by talking about pace, which is a Dan Hughes concept and probably my first introduction to him and his work when I was younger. It stands for playful, accepting, curious, empathetic, which really is the heart of how any counsellor should be with their clients, I think. It's in many ways what I began this episode rambling about genuine connection and care for. So to break it down, playfulness first is that fun. It's the beauty of just enjoying someone's company, the beauty of not exactly avoiding the seriousness, because I don't think being playful really does avoid it. I think it's a form of humour that kind of complements the seriousness. It's a kind of trust where you feel okay about being unserious, where you don't have to be in a total panic about the heaviness of stuff because it's not the end of the world, you know? Does that distinction make sense? I've never quite found the right words for it myself, to be honest. Accepting because we accept all of the person, the good as well as the bad, so that even when they're being their absolute worst, we are still playful and accepting and curious and empathetic. This is a constant attitude. When Katie's mad at Allison and throwing the cat away, Allison accepts Katie's being mad. She is allowed to be because Allison is here for all of Katie. Curious because we want to learn about them as a person, about their feelings, to get to know them, to be able to connect and form a bond, to remain attentive to everything. And in us being curious and trying to think through who they are, they then get to do that too. It helps them get better at also thinking about these things and being curious about themselves. And empathetic, to always have their feelings in mind, to always try to understand their feelings without judgment and to try to relate to their way of viewing things. That, in a nutshell, is pace. I think it's at the core of all good counselling, even if people don't use the words or know the concept. It's a way of being with someone that makes therapy therapeutic, and it's also something that'll apply to parenting and teaching situations in certain ways, not just for people like Katie, but sometimes for everyone. We will start to see these actions more in later chapters. I know there's not been much story in this one, or not that I've shared, because the story then leads us towards the home of Jackie and Mark Keller, the new foster parents. Jackie is somebody who understands pace and has worked closely with Allison in the past with another child who was similar to Katie called Gabe. With Jackie as the foster mum and Allison as the counsellor, they were able to help Gabe, so the same now may apply for Katie. That's kind of the plan. That's also, however, the next episode. This is where we end for now. Let me know your thoughts. Please support the series by liking the video, buy the book if you can afford it, subscribe or support me on Patreon if you fancy doing that, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Devon, Kestrel, Arwen, Stephen Legg, Janice McMahon, Samara Salsey, Sharikov2814, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell and Incomplete Sentience. Thank you.